As he's sitting on his luxury yacht, smoking the finest cigars known to man, his children are riding the horses he just bought them. At precisely this same time, in his West Avenue apartment in Manhattan, his wife is stacking shoeboxes from floor to ceiling that are stuffed with cash. The man we're talking about was the mob boss Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno, one of the many mobsters who made many millions from a life of crime. Like with most mobsters though, things turned very dark for him in the end. We'll come back to Salerno later, but first let's look at some people who also earned a ton of cash from criminal enterprises. Michael Franzese. It's hard to know just how much mob bosses earned or had stashed away for the simple fact that they don't exactly do their tax returns. Also, the authorities and the media have from time to time exaggerated how much cash gangsters have made from crime. We know this because some of them have talked about this exaggeration. One of these folks is Michael Franzese, who since retiring from a life of crime has talked on his podcast and other people's podcasts about how things in the American Mafia really went down. Franzese was certainly good at making money, but while many other mob guys throughout history might have made a bit more, not many of them have been so open about their life of crime. So Franzese is a good guy to start this list with. We also like the fact that in a video he once gave the infographic show a compliment for a story we did on him. Shout out to Michael, thank you. In that video he said, "I never thought they'd be telling my life story in an animated version." He also said there were some inconsistencies with the facts, but he was mostly complimentary in regard to the research we did. We said he made a staggering $8 million a week, but he corrected us and said that it was the gross, not what his outfit pocketed. He explained that a week's take could have been as much as $12 million, but I was probably putting $1 million a week in my pocket at that point in time, which was pretty good money. No kidding, Michael. He said he didn't have a personal plane and helicopter, but he and his partner bought those things together. Talking about the helicopter, he said, "We used it for business and just to get around town." So while the money he earned might not be as much as some media articles have stated, there's no doubt that Mr. Franzese was one of the wealthiest modern mob guys. "I knew how to use the life," he said, relating to how to make the most money and not get caught. That made him a significant amount of money, but how much exactly he didn't say. We're going to come back to him later, only because in terms of the facts, he rights a lot of wrongs. One thing you'll often hear Franzese saying is crime doesn't pay in the end. That's usually true, but it often pays well for a while. This next guy did seem to live with obscene wealth and not get punished for it. Anthony Joseph Accardo. Tony Accardo went from being a street criminal in his teens to becoming one of the most powerful mob bosses in mafia history. He was good at crime, and he stayed good at it for many decades. He was also ruthless, getting the nickname Joe Batters after he joined the Chicago outfit for the reason that he beat 3 guys to death with a baseball bat. Apparently, the boss, Al Capone, said, "Boy, this kid's a real Joe Batters." After Accardo took control of the Chicago outfit, he made a ton of money from such enterprises as drug smuggling, slot machines, and the odd bit of counterfeiting. He said he changed the business model of the outfit, which led to the golden era under his command. A fellow gangster once said of him, "Accardo had more brains for breakfast than Capone had in a lifetime." That's why back in 1986, when Fortune magazine put together a list of the 50 most powerful mob bosses, Accardo was second on the list. Number 1 we'll talk about soon. For a while, Accardo lived a life of luxury, but once there was too much heat on him, he decided to tone it down a bit. Still, with his money, he bought stores, newspapers, restaurants, travel agencies, trucking companies, paper factories, commercial office buildings, farms, hotels, and cars, and all kinds of other things, with the cops believing he had hidden millions. How many millions, we'll never know, but most mafia pundits put this man as one of the most successful mafia bosses of all time. More so because unlike the other mob guys, he managed to stay out of prison. He died aged 86 as a free man. Okay, so crime might have paid for that guy, but what about his former boss, Mr. Capone? Al Capone. Public enemy number 1, Al Capone, aka Scarface, doesn't need much of an introduction. You could say he's the face of American mobsterism, but his run at the top didn't last long. He was imprisoned when he was just 33 and he died from neurosyphilis in his late 40s. He can't be compared to Accardo in terms of business acumen and knowing how to take your money out of crime and into legitimate business, which is the way to go if you really want to be a success. Still, in Capone's short time as America's biggest gangster, he made a ton of cash. In the 1920s, when he was at the top of his game, he was bringing in insane amounts of money from bootleg. As you all know, when the prohibition gets tough, the gangsters get going. Some sources say he was making $60 million a year in his prime. If we use a currency inflation calculator, that would mean that during the height of prohibition in the mid-1920s, Capone was making around $1 billion a year. Other sources say at one point his net worth was over $100 million, which would have made him over a billionaire. He didn't hide his wealth in spite of the risks of not doing so. In 1928, he bought himself a luxury mansion on Palm Island in Florida. He paid $40,000 for it, which is just $646,000 in today's money. Still, in 2021, there were news reports saying it had just sold for $15.5 million. As you probably know, he was convicted of tax evasion and served his time. He died a very sick man in that luxury house aged just 48. But what happened to all of his cash? The book Uncle Al Capone, The Untold Story from Inside His Family, explains where some of it might have gone. That book says he once had a chat with his great niece, Deirdre Marie. He told her, "I put it in a bunch of different banks and had the safety deposit box keys and the names I used in a strong box. I buried the box, but when I went to dig it up, after I got out of prison, I couldn't find it. Then I thought I'd buried it in another place, but when I looked, it wasn't there either." We have to remember, the syphilis by this point was affecting his mental health. Still, today the media talks about the mystery of Capone's missing millions. In an interview with Vanity Fair not long ago, that niece of his said there is a lot of money missing. So we can't exactly say just how rich this man was. Maybe there wasn't as much money as people thought there was. As we said, things can get exaggerated when it comes to the wealth of gangsters, which might be the case for this next man. Meyer Lansky, sometimes called the mob's accountant. If there was a gangster that knew how to handle money, it was Mr. Lansky. He was actually part of a Jewish mob, but his ties were so close to the Italian-American mob that we can still add him to this list. Lansky made most of his cash from gambling, something in which he was an expert. He shouldn't be confused with another Jewish mobster who made tons of money from gambling, Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein, nicknamed the Brain, also amassed great wealth, possibly as much as $150 million in today's money. Still, it said Lansky earned more than that. He also lived a lot longer than Rothstein, who was shot and killed when he was just 46. He apparently got himself into debt over a card game, a debt that in today's money was something like $4.8 million. After he died, other gangsters took over many of his illegal enterprises, and one of them was Mr. Lansky. Lansky went on to earn a lot of money, which he managed to hide from the authorities by putting it into Swiss banks and offshore shell companies. The FBI never managed to get much of it, although Lansky always said he made his money legitimately. When he died in Florida in 1980 at 80 years old, the FBI said he had close to $300 million in earnings. Today, that would be closer to $700 million. Okay, so that would make him one of the richest mobsters ever. Trouble is, it seems he didn't have anything close to that. One of his granddaughters came forward after his death and said he'd only left behind $57,000, which would today only be about $130,000. His biographer later said that near to the end of his life, he barely had enough cash to pay for certain bills, never mind having a fortune. That same biographer said there was no evidence to sustain the notion of Lansky as king of all evil, the brains, the secret mover, the inspirer and controller of American organized crime. It was said, though, that even though he didn't have the cash in the bank or even have expensive properties, he did have money in other people's names. Still, it's very likely the FBI was wrong about his mass wealth. Okay, so what about one of his partners, the man called the father of modern organized crime in the USA, Charles Lucky Luciano? Back in 1925, this man was said to be making in the region of $12 million a year from bootlegging and illegal gambling, with that working out to $4 million in what he took home. In today's money, that would be around $63 million a year. But yet again, there's what they say and what you actually have. Luciano died in the 60s while living in Italy, and he didn't have any kids to leave the money to. In fact, we don't think he had a great deal of money to leave. Luciano had another partner back then, a man who's now said to have amassed more cash than most mobsters, Frank Costello. Word on the media street is that Costello at one point had a net worth of $1 billion, which would indeed put him right at the top of the list. He made cash bootlegging liquor, but the brunt of his money came via prostitution and gambling rackets, and later legitimate business operations. Known as the Prime Minister of the underworld, he certainly had a lot of power. He had a lot of respect, too, with the biographer once telling the New York Times he was a man who would go out of his way to avoid violence. He believed that with serious effort, there are a few things that can't be worked out peacefully. He also lived a long time, 82, and always kept a few fingers in criminal pies. But where do people get the 1 billion number from? It's hard to say because he kept his wealth well hidden. In 1964, he was arrested for vagrancy while eating lunch with a business acquaintance in a New York City restaurant. The cop at the time believed Costello was a multi-millionaire who'd made all his cash from crime. The reason they got him on vagrancy was the simple fact that he didn't have a job or proof of income, to which his lawyers said was the cops acting out of hand. At the time, Costello had $6 in his pocket, although his suit was worth $300. Quite a bit of money back then. But $1 billion? If he had that much, where did it all go? Not only that, it said his enterprises amassed around $60 billion for all those involved. Unfortunately, while many sources say what he was worth, we got somewhat lost on that money trail. But with this next guy, the trail wasn't so hard to follow. Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno. Mr. Salerno was said to be a billionaire and his wealth was more evident, so we think we can put him at the top of the richest gangsters list. When Fortune put together that list in 1986 of the richest mobsters in the USA that were still alive, he came on top. He could be the only bona fide billionaire on this list, but still you can't underestimate the media and authorities' readiness to exaggerate criminal wealth. In the 1960s, it said the numbers racket was bringing in around $50 million a year. If we use a currency calculator, in 1965, if he earned $50 million, that would be worth $439 million today. That's a lot of cash, and it said he also made money from loan sharking. But did he really have all that money? In 1977, Time magazine said he was indicted for running a numbers operation from Manhattan that netted him $10 million a year. That same article said he kept tons of money packed in shoe boxes in one of his houses and apartments. The article described his lifestyle as saying his lifestyle was typical. So too was the rigid insulation of his family from his life in the rackets. At home, a mafioso cultivates the images of a solid, church-going, charity-supporting citizen. On the job, he keeps up a flashy front by wining and dining associates at expensive restaurants and resorts. He had a place at Miami Beach, a 100-acre estate in upstate Rhinebeck, New York, and he had a luxury apartment in the high-cost neighborhood of Gramercy Park in Manhattan. He had lots of cars, a yacht, and even built an indoor horse-riding arena where his kids could practice on the horses he'd bought them. He's certainly starting to sound like a billionaire, if not a multi-millionaire. Straight-talking Michael Franzese once talked about Salerno, saying with respect that he was a chubby kind of fella that talked like a tough guy but was actually a really good guy. He only met him once, which ended with Franzese agreeing to help Salerno out by employing a few of his guys. As for that Fortune magazine list with Salerno at the top, Franzese once did a video about that. He called the list silly, and he said he didn't agree with it, stating as always there was misinformation about the mafia. He said it's impossible to know how much mobsters earned or still earn. He also stated that Vincent the Chin Gigante was a very powerful mobster and perhaps number one, but we can't find any evidence that he earned more than Salerno. Still, Franzese called Gigante the most powerful guy in the country. Maybe the media and the authorities just never discovered what kind of wealth Gigante had. If Salerno was behind in terms of wealth, it can't have been by a long way. With all that money, authorities were hot on Salerno's trail. One time, he was being wiretapped and he told another mobster he was upset about some young upstart actually calling him Fat Tony to his face. Angrily, he said on the phone, "If it wasn't for me, there wouldn't be no mob left. I made all the guys." That was one reason he was arrested in 1986. The cops figured he was number one in the country, which he wasn't, but he was still really high. Sometime after the arrest, one of the prosecution team went over to him and offered him a granola bar. He said to Salerno, "They're really much better for you, Mr. Salerno. Better than all that chocolate." Salerno, looking grumpy as always, replied, "Who the bleep cares? I'm gonna die in the bleeping can anyway." He did, and he was just 5 years into his 100-year sentence. He was 80 years old. As Franzese says, the life always catches up with you. By looking at the history of the mafia, you could say that for everything they earned, they paid back in pain and lost happiness. Now, you need to watch the full video on Franzese. Mafia boss reveals how he stole $8 million a week, or have a look at how the Italians did things and how the Great Mafia War killed thousands.